I have treated 1,000 patients across 47 species. I have held the six-chambered heart of a Drekthane warrior in my second hand, while my first hand stitched a wound that should have killed him twice over. I have mapped the crystalline nerve clusters of a Sylvan elder, traced the bioluminescent blood of a Fyron deep diver, and once spent 6 hours removing a parasite from the gill membrane of a Quar merchant who refused to stop talking the entire time. I thought I had seen everything biology had to offer. I was wrong. The rescue call came at the 3rd hour of my rest cycle. A mining collapse on asteroid KR7, a mid-size rock sitting at the edge of the Conclave's outer rim territories. Multiple species trapped, casualties unknown. I grabbed my kit, pulled on my coat, and boarded the rescue frigate without complaint. This was my job. This was the only thing I had ever wanted to do. When they pulled the survivors from the rubble, I moved through them quickly, triaging by species and severity. A Brek with a shattered foreleg, 2 Quar workers with smoke damage in their secondary lung clusters, a Sylvan child, frightened but unharmed, who clung to my coat until I gently passed her to one of the relief coordinators. I worked fast, and I worked clean. Then they carried in the human. I will admit something that I am not proud of. My first thought, when I saw him, was that he did not look like much. He was a large specimen by human standards, I was told later, but lying on that stretcher he seemed so exposed. No protective plating, no reinforced joints, no visible armor beneath the skin. Just soft tissue over a hidden frame, covered in dust and blood, breathing in shallow little pulls that told me immediately that something was wrong in his chest. His eyes were half closed, his face was calm in the way that faces sometimes go calm when the body is too tired to show pain anymore. His name was Marcus Hale, Sergeant Marcus Hale. The Conclave had only recently established formal diplomatic contact with Earth, and this was the first human I had ever treated. I had read the introductory medical brief that circulated through the Corps when the diplomatic channels opened. It described humans as soft-bodied, minimally armored, and reliant on external tools for most forms of protection. It recommended observation before any medical intervention, since so little was confirmed about their internal biology. I did not have the luxury of observation. He was hurt, and I was a healer, so I did what I always do. I ran the scan. The Resonance Bioscanner is the finest diagnostic tool the Conclave has produced. It reads an organism in layers, moving from the outermost tissue inward, building a complete picture of everything happening beneath the surface. It takes about 4 minutes for a full read on a new species. I stood beside the stretcher, watching the results appear on the display above him, and I remember thinking that the first layer was going to be simple. The first layer was not simple. His bones appeared on the display, and I leaned forward before I even realized I was doing it. The density reading was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of damage, but wrong in the sense that I had not expected it. The skeleton of this creature was not soft. It was hard and dense in a way that reminded me, genuinely, of the volcanic coral formations on Thresh 9, which are used as a building material in certain low-gravity construction projects. I cross-referenced the reading against the Conclave Species Index. The comparison held. This soft-looking creature was built around a frame that was harder than I had assumed from the outside by a significant measure. I filed that away and moved to the second layer. The second layer was worse. Or more accurately, it was more. The scanner maps scar tissue separately from current injury, and when those results came through, I actually made a sound. A small sound. Nothing professional about it. The body on that stretcher had been through things. Old burns across the left shoulder, long healed. A fracture line through the lower leg bone, refused cleanly. 2 separate impact injuries to the ribs, both historical. A puncture wound near the left side of the chest cavity that had healed so completely it was only visible as a faint density variation in the surrounding tissue. This organism had been broken repeatedly, and every single time, it had repaired itself. I pulled up his current injuries alongside the historical record and stood there for a moment, just looking at the contrast. The old damage was gone, rebuilt. The body had treated every wound like a problem to be solved, and had solved them all, one by one, over years, and carried on. I thought about what the brief had said. Soft-bodied, minimally armored. I thought that whoever wrote that brief had been looking at humans from the outside and had not thought very hard about what the outside was hiding. Then came the third layer, and the third layer changed everything. The scanner flagged a foreign material alert. This happens sometimes at mining sites. Workers get fragments of rock or processing compound embedded in tissue during accidents. I assumed that was what I was looking at, and I reached for the contamination protocol with my third hand, while my other hands continued checking his breathing. Then I read the material specification, and I stopped. Iron. The scanner had found iron in his bloodstream, not as a fragment, not as debris from the collapse, as a distributed, fully integrated component of his circulatory fluid, moving through every vessel in his body in consistent, measurable concentrations. The readings showed that this iron was not a recent addition. It was bonded to the larger molecules in his blood at a cellular level. Some of the bonding patterns the scanner estimated were decades old. I called my colleague Pesh over. Pesh has been a field medic for longer than I have, and is not easily impressed by anything. I showed Pesh the display without saying a word. Pesh stared at it for a long time without saying anything either. Then Pesh said, very quietly, "Is that structural ore?" And I said, "I think it is how they breathe," and we both stood there in silence for a moment. I ran the secondary analysis. The iron in his blood was not a defect. It was not a contamination. It was not a medical emergency. It was a feature. The large molecules it was bonded to were oxygen transport proteins, and the iron was the mechanism by which oxygen was captured in the lungs and carried to every cell in the body. Remove the iron and the oxygen delivery system collapsed. Remove the oxygen delivery system and the organism died within minutes. This species had evolved to incorporate metal into its blood as a fundamental survival mechanism. I kept reading because at that point, I could not stop. The calcium in his skeletal structure was not simply dense, it was actively maintained. The body produced it, regulated it, repaired it when damaged. The skeleton was not a fixed frame. It was a living system that rebuilt itself after fractures, sometimes emerging from the process slightly denser than before. Breaks that would end the mobility of several species I have treated were, for this organism, a temporary setback followed by a return to full function. The electrical signals in his nervous system fired at speeds that surprised me. The entire body was networked by biological wiring running at measurable voltages, and that network included a pain response that sent immediate signals to the brain whenever tissue was damaged. I sat with that detail for a while. His body told him, in real time, exactly how badly he was hurt. And from the evidence of his scar record, he had received that information many times and had continued functioning anyway. At the center of his chest, the scanner showed me his heart. A single pump, 4 chambers, compact, dense with muscle, working in a rhythm that had not stopped since before this creature could speak. The scanner calculated that at his age, which was 34 of his planet's years, his heart had beaten approximately 1.2 billion times. No external power, no maintenance access, no replacement mechanism, just one organ, doing one job, 1 billion times over, without rest, without pause, without complaint. I was still processing all of this when he opened his eyes. He looked up at the scanner display, then at me, and his first words were, "Am I dead?" His voice was rough and low, and he asked the question with an expression that suggested he was prepared for either answer. I told him no. I told him I had questions. He looked at my hands, which were, I realize now, trembling slightly. He looked at the display, which he obviously could not read. He looked back at me. "You look worried," he said. "Is that bad?" I told him I was a healer and that I was not worried. I was curious, and that I would appreciate it if he did not try to move, because his rib was fractured and his lung was not fully inflated. He said, "Yeah, I figured," and shifted his weight slightly anyway. I asked him about the iron. I told him my scanner had found metal in his blood, and I asked if he was aware of this. He looked at me with an expression I have come to understand, since that day, as the human expression for finding something unexpectedly funny. He said, "Yeah. Iron. It's in everybody's blood. It's how we carry oxygen around. Pretty normal stuff." "Pretty normal," he said. I asked about the bones, the density, the self-repair after fractures. He said calcium. "Yeah, bones break sometimes. Hurts a lot, but they heal back. Usually stronger, actually, at the break point." Usually stronger at the break point. I wrote that down. I asked about his heart. I told him that it had not stopped, as far as my scanner could tell, for 34 years. He was quiet for a second, and then he said, "Well, once it did. For about 40 seconds, doctors restarted it." I looked at him. He said this the way someone might mention a minor travel delay, an inconvenience that had been resolved. I asked how. "Electricity," he said. "They push a charge through the chest, and it shocks the heart back into rhythm. Works most of the time. They restart the central pump with electricity and continue." I wrote that down too. I asked about pain. I told him his nervous system was sending constant damage reports to his brain, based on my current readings, and asked how he was managing to hold a conversation. He shrugged with one shoulder, which pulled at the injury in his chest, and he winced, but he kept talking. "Pain tells you what's wrong," he said. "You deal with it. You keep going. You fix what you can fix and you manage what you can't. You deal with it. You keep going." I asked him one more question. I asked about the scars. I showed him the scan results. I pointed to the old burns, the healed fractures, the puncture near his lung. I asked, as gently as I could manage, how a person accumulates a history like that and continues. He was quiet for a longer moment this time. He looked at the ceiling of the medical bay. Then he looked back at me and said, "Same way as anything else, I guess. You don't really think about the whole list at once. You just deal with whatever's in front of you right now." I had no response to that. I stood there holding my scanner, and I had nothing to say. I stepped away from the stretcher and pulled the full scan results into a holographic display. I looked at the complete picture of him, the iron blood and the mineral bones and the electrical nerves, and the tireless pump in the center of it all. I thought about the medical brief: soft-bodied, minimally armored, recommend observation only. I thought about who had written that brief, and what they had seen, and what they had failed to understand. They had seen the outside, the soft skin, the exposed joints, the absence of natural plating, or claws, or venom, or any of the obvious features we look for when we assess a species. They had looked at the packaging and made their notes and moved on. They had not looked inside. Because inside was something else entirely. Inside was iron and calcium and bioelectricity, and a billion heartbeats, and a map of every wound ever survived. Inside was a machine that had been breaking and repairing and strengthening itself for 34 years, learning from every fracture, carrying every scar, as evidence not of weakness, but of a challenge that had been faced and outlasted. I had treated a Drekthane with 4 hearts. I had treated species with armored skin, redundant organ systems, regenerative tissue, natural toxin resistance. I had thought, without ever quite saying it out loud, that I had seen the full range of what life could build. I had not. I had been looking at life from one direction only. I had been measuring by the features that were visible and had never stopped to consider what a species might be carrying on the inside that the outside gave no hint of. I was still standing at the display when I heard movement behind me. I turned around. Marcus Hale was sitting up on the stretcher. Fractured rib, partially collapsed lung, 48 hours minimum of rest, recommended by every standard in my training. He was sitting up and he was looking across the medical bay, at the triage area, where my team was still working through the other survivors. He looked at me and said, "Are there other people who need help?" Not can I leave, not am I cleared, not what about me. Are there other people who need help? I looked at him for a long moment. Then I nodded and pointed toward the triage area without saying anything, because I did not trust myself to say the right thing. He stood up. He did it slowly and carefully, and I could see from the tension in his face exactly what it cost him. But he stood up, and he walked, with a slight lean that he was clearly trying to hide, toward the place where there were people who needed something done. I watched him go. Then I turned back to my scanner, and I began writing my report. I wrote the clinical details first, because that is the protocol. Fractured rib, grade 2 pulmonary compression, lacerations, mild concussion, prognosis good. Then I wrote the part that was not protocol. I wrote that I had spent years believing that I understood life, that I had treated enough species across enough systems to have a reasonable picture of what living things were made of and what they could endure. I wrote that I had been operating, without knowing it, with a very incomplete picture. I wrote that I had scanned a creature made of metal and mineral and electricity and quiet, unremarkable determination. that I had asked it questions, and it had answered them like the answers were obvious, that I had watched it stand up when it had every reason not to, and walk toward other people's problems before it had finished dealing with its own. I wrote that I became a healer because I wanted to understand life, and that today, for the first time in a long career, I had met something I did not fully understand. And I wrote, at the very end, that I meant that as the highest compliment I had ever recorded in a medical log,